Mayday! 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 The captain's desperate screams filled the cabin, then, silence. Complete, terrifying silence from the cockpit. 198 passengers frozen in horror, both pilots unconscious, the aircraft flying itself at 32,000 feet. No one trained to land. No one except a small girl walking toward the locked cockpit door, carrying knowledge that would save everyone. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 cruised through crystalline sky at 32,000 feet, its twin engines humming their eternal song of controlled combustion and precisely engineered thrust. Flight 2847 from Denver to Seattle carried 198 souls through the thin upper atmosphere where oxygen existed only in trace amounts and temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below zero. Inside the pressurized aluminum tube, passengers existed in their own small universes, businessmen reviewing presentations on laptops, families returning from vacations, a young couple holding hands across the armrest, and scattered throughout the cabin, solitary travelers lost in books or movies or their own internal landscapes. In seat 14C, near the wing's leading edge where she could watch the flaps extend and retract during takeoff and landing, sat 11-year-old Maya Chen. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her small hands held a tablet displaying what appeared to be a math worksheet. To the flight attendants who passed her seat during their routine cabin checks, she was just another unaccompanied minor, polite, quiet, requiring occasional monitoring but no particular concern. The woman in 14B had smiled at her during boarding, that particular smile adults reserve for children traveling alone, a mixture of sympathy and approval for her apparent self-sufficiency. What nobody could see was the aviation manual she'd downloaded onto her tablet, disguised behind a simple tap between screens. What they couldn't know was that Maya had spent the last 4 years since her father's death studying every aspect of commercial aviation with an obsession that bordered on pathological. Captain David Chen had been a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation, and in the 2 years before his fatal heart attack, he had taught his daughter things that no 7-year-old should have needed to know: emergency procedures, system redundancies, the specific sequence of actions required when everything goes catastrophically wrong at altitude. You have to understand the aircraft, he told her during their countless hours in his home flight simulator, his hand covering hers on the throttle quadrant. Not just the procedures, but why each system exists, what happens when they fail, how everything connects. Most pilots go their entire careers without facing a real emergency. But if you ever do, Maya, you need to know that panic kills faster than any mechanical failure. She'd been 7 years old, sitting in a chair with 2 cushions beneath her so she could reach the controls properly, and she'd absorbed every word as though her life depended on it. After he died, she'd continued studying, not from any premonition of disaster, but because those hours with her father in the simulator were the only place she could still feel his presence. Her mother worried about her obsession, gently suggesting grief counseling, but Maya couldn't explain that she wasn't trying to hold on to her father's memory. She was trying to become the pilot he'd been teaching her to be. Her father had been methodical in his teaching, starting with basic aerodynamics before moving to systems knowledge. He'd explained how the wings generated lift through pressure differentials, how the engines compressed and combusted air to create thrust, how the hydraulic systems translated pilot inputs into control surface movements. He'd made her memorize emergency checklists, quiz her on system failures, practice abnormal procedures until they became automatic. On weekends, they'd spend entire afternoons in the simulator he'd built in their garage, a faithful recreation of a 737 cockpit that he'd assembled from salvaged parts and custom electronics. The aircraft wants to fly, he'd tell her during their sessions. Your job isn't to force it to do anything. Your job is to manage its energy, guide its trajectory, make small corrections rather than large ones. Smooth hands, Maya. Always smooth hands. She'd crashed countless times in the simulator, landing too fast, stalling on approach, overshooting runways, losing control during engine failures. Each crash was followed by a patient debrief where her father would explain what went wrong, what she should have done differently, what indications she'd missed. He never grew frustrated with her mistakes. Instead, He treated each failure as valuable data, each crash as a lesson learned in safety rather than in tragedy. The cabin had settled into that peculiar midday quietness of a routine flight. The seatbelt sign had been off for 90 minutes. Flight attendants were preparing the beverage service. A baby 3 rows back made soft cooing sounds. Someone's laptop chimed with an incoming email. Maya had been working on actual homework. She had a history test coming up next week on the American Revolution, but her mind kept drifting to the flight instruments she knew were active just beyond the cockpit door. She wondered what altitude they were maintaining, what their ground speed was, whether they were experiencing any headwinds that would affect their arrival time. The aircraft flew itself through the autopilot system, following its predetermined route with inhuman precision while the pilots monitored instruments and communicated with air traffic control in the clipped, professional language of aviation. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as the thousands of commercial flights that crossed the country every single day. Then the captain's voice cut through the cabin intercom, and the entire world changed in the space between heartbeats. Mayday! 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 The words weren't spoken. They were screamed, raw, desperate, filled with a terror so primal that every passenger instantly understood they were hearing a trained professional confronting something beyond his ability to manage. The captain's voice carried the specific desperation of someone watching death approach with absolute certainty, the final desperate cry of a man who knows his training and experience are insufficient for whatever is happening in the cockpit. The cabin froze. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The businessman in 12A stopped typing, his fingers suspended above the keyboard. The young couple's hands tightened around each other with painful intensity. The mother 3 rows back instinctively pulled her baby closer. 198 people stopped breathing simultaneously, stopped moving, stopped existing for that frozen moment as their minds processed what their ears had just heard. Mayday! 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 The captain's desperate screams filled the cabin, then, silence. Complete, terrifying silence from the cockpit. 198 passengers frozen in horror, both pilots unconscious, the aircraft flying itself at 32,000 feet. No one trained to land. No one except a small girl walking toward the locked cockpit door, carrying knowledge that would save everyone. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 cruised through crystalline sky at 32,000 feet, its twin engines humming their eternal song of controlled combustion and precisely engineered thrust. Flight 2847 from Denver to Seattle carried 198 souls through the thin upper atmosphere where oxygen existed only in trace amounts and temperatures plunged to 50 degrees below zero. Inside the pressurized aluminum tube, passengers existed in their own small universes, businessmen reviewing presentations on laptops, families returning from vacations, a young couple holding hands across the armrest, and scattered throughout the cabin, solitary travelers lost in books or movies or their own internal landscapes. In seat 14C, near the wing's leading edge where she could watch the flaps extend and retract during takeoff and landing, sat 11-year-old Maya Chen. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her small hands held a tablet displaying what appeared to be a math worksheet. To the flight attendants who passed her seat during their routine cabin checks, she was just another unaccompanied minor, polite, quiet, requiring occasional monitoring but no particular concern. The woman in 14B had smiled at her during boarding, that particular smile adults reserve for children traveling alone, a mixture of sympathy and approval for her apparent self-sufficiency. What nobody could see was the aviation manual she'd downloaded onto her tablet, disguised behind a simple tap between screens. What they couldn't know was that Maya had spent the last 4 years since her father's death studying every aspect of commercial aviation with an obsession that bordered on pathological. Captain David Chen had been a 20-year veteran of commercial aviation, and in the 2 years before his fatal heart attack, he had taught his daughter things that no 7-year-old should have needed to know: emergency procedures, system redundancies, the specific sequence of actions required when everything goes catastrophically wrong at altitude. You have to understand the aircraft, he told her during their countless hours in his home flight simulator, his hand covering hers on the throttle quadrant. Not just the procedures, but why each system exists, what happens when they fail, how everything connects. Most pilots go their entire careers without facing a real emergency. But if you ever do, Maya, you need to know that panic kills faster than any mechanical failure. She'd been 7 years old, sitting in a chair with 2 cushions beneath her so she could reach the controls properly, and she'd absorbed every word as though her life depended on it. After he died, she'd continued studying, not from any premonition of disaster, but because those hours with her father in the simulator were the only place she could still feel his presence. Her mother worried about her obsession, gently suggesting grief counseling, but Maya couldn't explain that she wasn't trying to hold on to her father's memory. She was trying to become the pilot he'd been teaching her to be. Her father had been methodical in his teaching, starting with basic aerodynamics before moving to systems knowledge. He'd explained how the wings generated lift through pressure differentials, how the engines compressed and combusted air to create thrust, how the hydraulic systems translated pilot inputs into control surface movements. He'd made her memorize emergency checklists, quiz her on system failures, practice abnormal procedures until they became automatic. On weekends, they'd spend entire afternoons in the simulator he'd built in their garage, a faithful recreation of a 737 cockpit that he'd assembled from salvaged parts and custom electronics. The aircraft wants to fly, he'd tell her during their sessions. Your job isn't to force it to do anything. Your job is to manage its energy, guide its trajectory, make small corrections rather than large ones. Smooth hands, Maya. Always smooth hands. She'd crashed countless times in the simulator, landing too fast, stalling on approach, overshooting runways, losing control during engine failures. Each crash was followed by a patient debrief where her father would explain what went wrong, what she should have done differently, what indications she'd missed. He never grew frustrated with her mistakes. Instead, he treated each failure as valuable data, each crash as a lesson learned in safety rather than in tragedy. The cabin had settled into that peculiar midday quietness of a routine flight. The seatbelt sign had been off for 90 minutes. Flight attendants were preparing the beverage service. A baby 3 rows back made soft cooing sounds. Someone's laptop chimed with an incoming email. Maya had been working on actual homework. She had a history test coming up next week on the American Revolution, but her mind kept drifting to the flight instruments she knew were active just beyond the cockpit door. She wondered what altitude they were maintaining, what their ground speed was, whether they were experiencing any headwinds that would affect their arrival time. The aircraft flew itself through the autopilot system, following its predetermined route with inhuman precision while the pilots monitored instruments and communicated with air traffic control in the clipped, professional language of aviation. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as the thousands of commercial flights that crossed the country every single day. Then the captain's voice cut through the cabin intercom, and the entire world changed in the space between heartbeats. Mayday! 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 The words weren't spoken. They were screamed, raw, desperate, filled with a terror so primal that every passenger instantly understood they were hearing a trained professional confronting something beyond his ability to manage. The captain's voice carried the specific desperation of someone watching death approach with absolute certainty, the final desperate cry of a man who knows his training and experience are insufficient for whatever is happening in the cockpit. The cabin froze. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The businessman in 12A stopped typing, his fingers suspended above the keyboard. The young couple's hands tightened around each other with painful intensity. The mother 3 rows back instinctively pulled her baby closer. 198 people stopped breathing simultaneously, stopped moving, stopped existing for that frozen moment as their minds processed what their ears had just heard. And she was the only person on this aircraft who understood what Mayday Mayday followed by silence actually meant. The only person who knew that dual pilot incapacitation, while extraordinarily rare, could occur from rapid decompression, toxic fumes, carbon monoxide poisoning, or a dozen other scenarios that affected both pilots before either could don oxygen masks. The only person who had spent 4 years studying emergency procedures obsessively, who had logged hundreds of hours in a home flight simulator, who had been trained by a veteran captain who believed that knowledge could save lives even if that knowledge lived in a 7-year-old girl. She could see Karen and another flight attendant conferring urgently near the cockpit door. She could hear passengers around her spiraling into panic. Someone was praying loudly in Spanish. Someone else was sobbing uncontrollably. The baby was screaming now, sensing the terror surrounding it. Several passengers were on their phones, leaving what they believed were final messages to loved ones. The cabin had transformed from peaceful routine into collective horror, and it was getting worse with every second that the cockpit remained silent. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt. The click of the mechanism releasing seemed impossibly loud despite the chaos surrounding her. Her legs felt unsteady as she stood, and for a moment she thought she might sit back down, might let the adults handle this, might return to being just an 11-year-old girl who didn't have to bear impossible responsibility. But there were no adults who could handle this. That was the terrible truth. Every single person in this cabin was depending on pilots who were unconscious or dead, and without intervention, every single person would die when the aircraft exhausted its fuel and descended into terrain. Then she remembered her father's voice from a simulator session when she'd been 8 years old, practicing emergency descents. She'd made a mistake in her procedure, had become frustrated, had said she couldn't do it. "Maya, listen to me," he'd said, pausing the simulation and turning to face her with complete seriousness. "There's a moment in every real emergency when you have to choose. You can freeze, let fear take over, hope someone else will fix it. Or you can act. You can use your training, trust your knowledge, and do what needs to be done even when you're terrified. That choice, that moment, that's what separates people who survive from people who don't. The aircraft doesn't care about your age or your size or whether you're scared. It only responds to correct inputs. If you know what to do and you do it, you survive. If you freeze, you die. It's that simple." She started walking toward the cockpit. Each step felt like moving through water, but she kept going, her small form moving steadily through the chaos of panicking adults. The woman from 14B called out to her, "Sweetie, sit down, it's not safe to be walking around," but Maya kept moving. A man grabbed at her shoulder, trying to pull her back to safety, but she slipped past him. Several passengers were now crowding toward the front, their panic making them aggressive, demanding answers, demanding action. The flight attendants were trying to maintain order, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Maya pushed through the crowd, her small size actually an advantage as she slipped between larger adults. She could see Karen more clearly now. The flight attendant was still trying the intercom, her face pale, her professional composure barely maintained. The other attendant, a younger man named Derek, was explaining something to a passenger who had approached them, his hands moving in calming gestures that weren't working. Maya reached them, ducking under an reaching arm, squeezing past 2 arguing men. "I need to get into the cockpit," she said, her voice somehow steady despite the terror thundering through her chest. Karen looked down at her with surprise mixed with concern. "Honey, you need to return to your seat. We're handling the situation." "Both pilots are incapacitated," Maya said, using the technical term deliberately. "That's why they're not responding. You need to open the cockpit door, and I need to get inside." Derek's expression shifted from concern to confusion. "Sweetie, the pilots are just dealing with an emergency. They'll communicate when they can. Right now, the safest thing is for you to go back to your seat and buckle up." The captain screamed Mayday 3 times and then went silent, Maya said, her voice louder now, projecting with the authority her father had taught her for radio communications. "That's not normal emergency procedure. That's incapacitation. Both pilots are unconscious or dead, and this aircraft needs someone in control immediately." Several passengers nearby had stopped their own panic to listen to this exchange, confused by the sight of an 11-year-old girl arguing with flight attendants about pilot incapacitation. Karen's expression changed. Maya saw the moment when the flight attendant's training kicked in, when she started evaluating Maya's words not as a child's panic but as specific technical knowledge that no 11-year-old should possess. "Why do you know that?" Karen asked, her voice sharp now, professional. "How do you know aviation terminology?" "My father was Captain David Chen, 20 years with United Airlines," Maya said, the words tumbling out faster now. "He trained me on emergency procedures starting when I was 7 years old. I've logged 300 hours on a Level D flight simulator. I know systems, I know procedures, I know how to fly this aircraft. And right now I'm the only person on board who does. Every second we waste is a second closer to running out of fuel or encountering another emergency that nobody can handle." She could see them processing this, could see the war between their training to protect children and their understanding that something catastrophic was happening. Around them, passengers were watching now, some moving closer, drawn by the strange sight of an 11-year-old girl arguing with flight attendants while the cockpit remained silent. "She's just a kid," a male passenger said. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Maya said, turning to face him. The captain's mayday calls followed by silence indicate rapid pilot incapacitation, most likely from toxic fumes or rapid decompression affecting the cockpit. The autopilot is currently maintaining flight, but it cannot land the aircraft. Without pilot intervention, this aircraft will continue flying until fuel exhaustion, then descend into terrain. Everyone on board will die. I have training. I have knowledge. And I'm the only option you have." The man stared at her, his face pale. "I'm going to breach the cockpit door," Karen said finally, making a decision. "Derek, prepare the cabin for emergency procedures. Get everyone seated and belted. She looked at Maya with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and desperate hope, "stay with me. If you're lying to me, if this is some kind of panic response, I need to know right now." "I'm not lying," Maya said. "My father trained me for this exact scenario. Check his records if you want. Captain David Chen, United Airlines, died 4 years ago. He built a flight simulator in our garage. He taught me everything he knew. Open that door." Karen used her emergency override code on the cockpit door. There was a mechanical sound, a series of clicks as the reinforced locking mechanisms released. The door swung inward, revealing the cockpit, and Maya's worst fears confirmed. Both pilots were slumped over their controls, completely unresponsive. The captain's hand was still on the yoke, his body collapsed forward against his restraints. The first officer was leaning to the left, his head against the side window, his breathing shallow but visible. The cockpit showed no signs of damage, no smoke, no depressurization warnings. Whatever had incapacitated them had done so silently and suddenly, exactly the profile of carbon monoxide or toxic fume exposure. Maya didn't wait for permission. She pushed past Karen and climbed into the captain's seat, her small body dwarfed by the equipment designed for adult pilots. Her feet dangled several inches above the rudder pedals. The yoke seemed enormous in her small hands. But the instrument panel in front of her was exactly like her father's simulator, the primary flight display, the navigation display, the engine instruments, all arranged in the same pattern she'd studied for 4 years. For a moment, the weight of what she was doing threatened to overwhelm her. She was 11 years old. She was sitting in the pilot's seat of a commercial aircraft with 197 people depending on her. She had never flown a real aircraft. Everything she knew came from a simulator in a garage and the teachings of a father who had been dead for 4 years. Then her father's voice echoed in her memory, "The aircraft doesn't care about your age or your size or whether you're scared. It only responds to correct inputs. Call air traffic control," she said to Karen, her voice remarkably steady despite her hammering heart. "Tell them we have dual pilot incapacitation and an 11-year-old pilot in training taking control. I need guidance for approach and landing procedures. And get these pilots out of here, we need medical assessment." Karen was staring at her with open shock, but Derek was already moving, picking up the radio handset, his training overriding his disbelief. Another flight attendant appeared in the doorway, and together they began carefully extracting the unconscious captain from his seat, moving him to the cabin where they could attempt revival and medical assessment. Maya's hands found the controls with muscle memory built from hundreds of simulator hours. She checked the autopilot status first, engaged, maintaining altitude and heading. Good. That gave her time to assess the situation. She scanned the instruments systematically, exactly as her father had taught her. Airspeed, 280 knots. Altitude, 32,000 feet, maintaining. Heading, 320 degrees, engines normal, N1 at 82%, N2 at 94%, temperatures nominal, fuel showing 11,000 pounds remaining. No warning lights except the autopilot caution indicator that someone not in the pilot's seat was touching the controls. Denver Center, this is United Flight 2847, Derek's voice came over the radio, professional despite the surreal circumstances. We have an emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated. We have an 11-year-old with flight training taking control. Request immediate guidance for emergency landing procedures. The radio crackled with silence for 3 seconds that felt like an hour. Maya could imagine the controller's face, the disbelief, the immediate escalation to supervisors. Then a male voice responded, carefully controlled but audibly shocked, Flight 2847, Denver Center. Say again your last transmission. Denver Center, both pilots unconscious, unable to determine cause, Derek said, his voice gaining confidence. Appears to be toxic fume exposure or similar. Passenger with extensive flight simulator training has taken control of the aircraft. She's 11 years old. Request vectors to nearest suitable airport and full emergency response. Flight 2847, understand you have dual pilot incapacitation and, untrained pilot now controlling the aircraft. The controller's voice betrayed his disbelief even through professional training. Maya leaned forward, adjusting the seat position as far forward as it would go, her feet still not reaching the rudder pedals. She grabbed a cushion from the first officer's seat and wedged it behind her back. She took the radio handset from Derek, her small hand barely wrapping around it properly. Denver Center, this is Maya Chen in command of Flight 2847, she said, keeping her voice calm and professional like her father had taught her for radio communications. I have approximately 300 hours on Boeing 737 flight simulator, trained by Captain David Chen, United Airlines. I'm 11 years old. My feet don't reach the rudder pedals properly. But I understand aircraft systems, emergency procedures, and I'm currently the only option you have for getting 198 people safely on the ground. I need your help, but I can do this. Another pause, longer this time. Maya could imagine the chaos erupting in the control center, supervisors being called, FAA officials being notified, emergency procedures being pulled up that had probably never been used before. Then the controller's voice returned, and Maya could hear the shift in his tone, the moment when he made the decision to treat this as a real emergency requiring real response rather than some impossible situation that couldn't be happening. Maya, this is Controller Davis, and I want you to know that I'm a flight instructor in my off hours with 15 years of experience. I'm going to talk you through this step by step, and we're going to get everyone safely on the ground. First thing, do not touch the autopilot. It's keeping you stable and level. Can you confirm the autopilot is engaged? Affirmative, autopilot engaged, aircraft stable at 32,000 feet, heading 320, speed 280 knots, Maya responded, using proper aviation terminology automatically. Engines showing normal parameters, fuel at 11,000 pounds. Outstanding. Maya, I'm bringing in additional support right now, we're going to have some of the best pilots in the country helping us. But you're doing exactly right. I need you to check your navigation display. Can you tell me what you see? Maya studied the navigation screen, identifying the waypoints and airport identifiers exactly as her father had taught her. I see our current position approximately 120 nautical miles northwest of Denver International. Flight plan shows waypoints BRAYY, then JMS, then Blaze. Denver International showing on display bearing 135 degrees from current position. Perfect navigation reading. Maya, I'm going to coordinate with Denver Tower for emergency clearance. We're going to bring you back to Denver. The weather is clear, winds are light, and we'll have every emergency vehicle ready. But first, I need to know, have you practiced landing procedures in your simulator? Yes, sir. Multiple scenarios including emergency descents, single-engine approaches, system failures during approach, crosswind landings. She didn't mention that she'd crashed on at least 40% of her simulated landings. Didn't mention that even her successful simulator landings have been rough and imprecise. Didn't mention that the simulator couldn't replicate the actual weight and momentum of 200,000 pounds of aircraft or the real consequence of failure. Maya, I'm going to be with you every step of the way. Right now, your aircraft is stable and safe. We're not in immediate danger. We have fuel, we have time, and we have a clear runway waiting for you. What I need you to do now is take a deep breath and trust your training. Your father taught you well. Can you do that for me? I can do that. Her voice didn't shake. Her father would have been proud. Good. Now, I'm patching in Captain Sarah Mitchell from United Airlines. She's going to coordinate with me on the technical procedures. Maya, you're not alone up there. We have a team supporting you. A woman's voice came on the frequency, warm but professional. Maya, this is Captain Mitchell. I knew your father, we flew together several years ago. He was an exceptional pilot and an exceptional man. What he taught you is going to save lives today. Are you ready to work with us? Tears suddenly blurred Maya's vision, but she blinked them away. Yes, ma'am. I'm ready. The next hour unfolded in a series of careful procedures coordinated between Maya and an increasingly large team of controllers, pilots, and emergency coordinators who had joined the frequency. Maya learned that the FAA had been notified at the highest levels, that emergency response teams at Denver were mobilizing, that commercial pilots from multiple airlines had volunteered to provide guidance, that news helicopters were already launching to document what was being called an unprecedented aviation emergency. Military jets were being scrambled to provide visual escort. Hospitals were clearing trauma bays. The story was breaking on news channels worldwide. An 11-year-old girl attempting to land a commercial aircraft with 198 lives depending on her success. But inside the cockpit, Maya forced herself to focus only on the immediate tasks. She worked with Controller Davis and Captain Mitchell to program a descent profile into the flight management computer, carefully selecting waypoints that would bring them down from 32,000 feet in a gradual, controlled descent. She monitored the engines constantly, watching for any irregularities in the precise dance of turbine speeds and exhaust temperatures. She checked the weather at Denver every 10 minutes, memorizing the wind direction and runway configurations. Karen had remained in the cockpit, monitoring the unconscious first officer who was still slumped in his seat. They'd been unable to extract him without potentially damaging controls. She'd also kept Maya supplied with water and had, without being asked, found additional cushions from the first-class cabin to prop behind Maya's back and beneath her to help her reach the controls more effectively. "How are you doing?" Karen asked quietly during a moment when the radio traffic paused. "Scared," Maya admitted. "But my father taught me that scared doesn't mean incapable. It just means you're paying attention to the danger. Your father sounds like he was an incredible man." He was. And he prepared me for this, even though neither of us knew it at the time. "Beginning descent now," Maya announced on the radio as they approached the predetermined descent point. She reached up to the autopilot control panel, the altitude selector was just within her reach, and carefully programmed it to descend to 24,000 feet. She set the vertical speed to -500 feet per minute, a gentle descent rate that wouldn't alarm passengers or stress the aircraft structure. The aircraft's nose pitched down slightly, and she felt her stomach lift as they began descending. Through the cockpit windows, she could see the ground far below beginning to take on more definition, the abstract brown and green landscape starting to resolve into individual features. "Looking good, Maya," Controller Davis said. Descent rate is perfect. You're doing outstanding. The descent continued in stages, 24,000, then 18,000, then 12,000. Each phase required careful monitoring, constant communication, absolute focus. Maya's hands were sweating on the yoke despite the cool cockpit temperature. Her back ached from the awkward position of being too small for the pilot's seat. Her legs were starting to cramp from holding them in an unnatural position to reach the pedals when needed. Behind her, in the cabin, flight attendants had briefed passengers on the situation. The panic had transformed into something different, a collective holding of breath, a shared understanding that their fate rested in the hands of a child who somehow possessed the knowledge their trained pilots couldn't use. Some passengers prayed. Others wrote final messages. Many simply watched the sky pass by their windows and trusted that the impossible might somehow become possible. At 12,000 feet, Controller Davis's voice took on a different tone. Maya, we need to talk about the approach and landing. I'm going to walk you through every single step, but I need you to understand something important. The hardest part of landing is the flare, that's the moment right before touchdown when you pull back on the yoke to raise the nose and slow the descent. It requires judgment and timing that comes from experience. You may not get it perfect, and that's okay. Your goal is to get the aircraft on the runway, even if it's a hard landing. The 737 is built to withstand landing forces much greater than normal operations. Do you understand? I understand, Maya said, her mouth dry despite the water Karen had given her. I've practiced flare in the simulator, but I know it'll be different in the real aircraft. It will be different, Captain Mitchell said. But Maya, I want you to trust your instincts. When you see the runway coming up to meet you, when you feel like it's time to pull back, trust that feeling. Your subconscious has absorbed more from those simulator hours than you realize. They vectored her around for the approach, turning her onto the final approach course aligned with runway 34 right. Maya could see Denver International Airport ahead now, the distinctive white tensile roof structure visible even from miles away. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, their lights visible even in afternoon daylight. She could see news helicopters hovering at safe distances. She could see what looked like thousands of people gathered at observation points around the airport. Maya, you're established on the ILS, Controller Davis said. The autopilot is tracking the electronic glide slope perfectly. Continue your descent. You're going to cross the runway threshold at approximately 150 feet above ground level, and that's when you'll disconnect the autopilot and take manual control for the landing. Remember, you're aiming for the touchdown zone markers, those are the thick white stripes on the runway. Nose slightly up, power reduced gradually, let the aircraft settle onto the runway. Understood. Aiming for touchdown zone, nose up, reduce power, settle to runway. And Maya, Captain Mitchell added, after you touch down, immediately deploy the speed brakes, that's the lever on the center console, and apply brakes firmly. The 737 has excellent braking systems. Don't be afraid to use them. Speed brakes after touchdown, firm braking. Got it. At 1,000 feet above ground level, Maya could see individual vehicles on the highway passing beneath them. At 500 feet, Denver Tower took over the communications. Flight 2847, you are cleared to land runway 34 right. Wind calm. Emergency equipment standing by. You can do this, Maya. At 200 feet, Maya reached up with her right hand and pressed the red autopilot disconnect button on the yoke. The aircraft became instantly more sensitive in her hands, no longer guided by computer precision but dependent on her small hands and imperfect judgment. She could feel every slight air current, every minor change in the aircraft's attitude. The runway rushed up toward her, the white centerline stripes beginning to separate into individual markings. She was coming in slightly fast, the airspeed indicator showed 140 knots when it should have been closer to 130. She pulled back the throttles, feeling the engine spool down, feeling the aircraft begin to settle faster. Too fast. She was descending too quickly. The runway was coming up too fast. She pulled back gently on the yoke, raising the nose slightly, slowing the descent rate. The runway threshold markers passed beneath her. She was over the runway now, 30 feet above the concrete, then 25, then 20. She pulled back more on the yoke, trying to flare the aircraft, trying to transition from descent to touchdown the way she'd practiced hundreds of times in the simulator. The aircraft ballooned slightly, she'd pulled too hard, too fast, then began settling again more rapidly. She reduced power completely, pulling the throttles to idle position, holding the yoke back to maintain nose-up attitude. The main landing gear hit the runway with a tremendous bang that reverberated through the entire aircraft. The impact was far harder than any commercial landing should be, hard enough that Maya's teeth clacked together, hard enough that she heard gasps and screams from the cabin behind her. The nose gear slammed down a second later with another jarring impact, and suddenly they were rolling, decelerating, but still going far too fast, 120 knots, 110, 95. Speed brakes. Karen shouted, pointing to the center console. Maya's hand found the speed brake lever, pulling it back to full deployment. She felt the aircraft's deceleration increase as the panels deployed on the wings, disrupting lift and increasing drag. She pressed her feet down hard on the brake pedals, they were barely within her reach, applying pressure the way her father had taught her, feeling the anti-skid system pulse under her feet as it prevented the wheels from locking. They were still rolling too fast. The end of the runway was visible ahead, growing closer. Maya kept pressure on the brakes, kept the speed brakes deployed, kept the nose wheel centered on the runway centerline. 80 knots. 70. 60. The deceleration pressed her forward against the shoulder harness. 50 knots. 40. The runway exit signs were passing more slowly now. 30 knots. 20. The aircraft was responding properly, slowing steadily, the brakes doing exactly what they were designed to do. At 15 knots, Maya eased off the brakes slightly, letting the aircraft roll at taxi speed. At 10 knots, she applied parking brake gently, and the aircraft came to a complete stop approximately 3/4 of the way down the runway, safely stopped with plenty of remaining runway ahead. Through the cockpit windows, Maya could see emergency vehicles already racing toward them, fire trucks and ambulances converging on the aircraft from multiple directions. She could see the flashing lights, could hear the sirens even through the cockpit windows. She sat frozen for a moment, her hands still gripping the yoke, her body not quite believing that they had stopped, that they were on the ground, that 198 people had just survived because an 11-year-old girl had remembered everything her dead father had taught her. Flight 2847, Denver Tower, the controller's voice was thick with emotion. Congratulations. That was outstanding. Emergency vehicles are approaching your position. Stand by for assistance. Maya's hand started shaking violently. She tried to release the yoke but her fingers wouldn't uncurl. Karen reached over gently, carefully prying Maya's small fingers free from the controls. The flight attendant was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face. You did it, Karen whispered, her voice breaking. Oh my God, Maya. You actually did it. The radio frequency erupted with voices, controllers, pilots, emergency coordinators, all talking at once in a mixture of professional debriefing and raw emotional reaction to what they just witnessed. Captain Mitchell's voice cut through, Maya Chen, this is Captain Mitchell. What you just accomplished is going to be studied and talked about for decades. You saved every single person on that aircraft. Your father would be incredibly proud. Behind them, from the cabin, came the sound of 197 people cheering, crying, shouting with relief and disbelief. Someone started clapping, and within seconds the entire cabin erupted in applause that echoed through the aircraft, sustained and thunderous. Maya could hear people sobbing with relief, could hear voices raised in prayer and thanksgiving. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She tried to stand and found her legs wouldn't support her, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the landing was draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. Karen caught her immediately, lifting her small form easily, holding her while Maya's body finally processed what had just happened. "I was so scared," Maya whispered into Karen's shoulder. "The whole time, I was so scared." "Being scared and doing it anyway, that's what courage is," Karen said softly. "That's what heroism looks like." Emergency medical personnel boarded within minutes, rushing to treat the still unconscious pilots and to check the passengers for injuries from the hard landing. Investigators followed, FAA officials, airline safety officers, NTSB representatives, people in suits with credentials and clipboards who stared at Maya with expressions ranging from disbelief to awe. The passengers were evacuated via stairs that emergency vehicles positioned at the aircraft doors. As they exited, many of them looked back toward the cockpit, trying to catch a glimpse of the 11-year-old girl who had saved their lives. Some were crying. Others stood in small groups on the tarmac, holding each other, processing their survival. But Maya barely noticed any of it. She was watching the unconscious pilots being carefully extracted from the cockpit, loaded onto stretchers, rushed to waiting ambulances with full medical teams. They were alive. Still breathing. Would recover, investigators later determined, once doctors identified and treated the carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty heater that had flooded the cockpit with odorless, invisible death. Her mother arrived 3 hours later, brought from the terminal by airline officials who had recognized her name when they pulled up Maya's passenger manifest and realized the child pilot's mother had been waiting at the gate for her daughter's arrival. She'd watched the entire landing from the terminal, had seen the news coverage, had understood with growing horror and pride that her daughter was piloting the emergency aircraft everyone was talking about. When they finally brought Maya to the operations center where her mother waited, there was a long moment where neither of them could speak. Her mother's face was streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she reached for her daughter. Then she pulled Maya into her arms and held her with a desperate intensity, as though trying to convince herself that Maya was real, was safe, was alive. "Your father," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "Oh Maya, your father. He knew, didn't he? That's why he taught you all those things. He knew that someday, somewhere, someone would need you to remember." Maya nodded against her mother's shoulder, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Her father had known. Not this exact situation, not this specific emergency, but he'd understood that knowledge could save lives, that preparation mattered, that teaching his daughter to fly wasn't about creating a pilot but about giving her capabilities that might someday mean the difference between survival and tragedy. That night, the story exploded across every media platform in the world. News channels showed footage of the landing, rough and imperfect but successful, the aircraft touching down with visible force before rolling to a stop. Reporters camped outside their hotel. The airline issued statements praising Maya's courage while carefully navigating the liability questions of how an 11-year-old had ended up flying their aircraft. The FAA launched an investigation into pilot incapacitation protocols and how a child had accessed flight training materials and simulator time. The aviation community debated emergency procedures, training requirements, the astronomical odds of dual pilot incapacitation. Aviation experts appeared on news programs, analyzing every second of the approach and landing, discussing the technical complexity of what Maya had accomplished, debating whether her father's training had been appropriate or reckless. Some called her a hero. Others questioned whether children should be exposed to such intensive technical training. Everyone had an opinion about the 11-year-old who had landed a commercial aircraft. But Maya heard none of it that first night. She sat in her hotel room with her mother, looking at old photos of her father in his captain's uniform, remembering the hours they'd spent together in the simulator where he'd taught her that knowledge could save lives, that training mattered, that sometimes extraordinary circumstances required ordinary people to become extraordinary. "I miss him," she whispered, tracing her father's face in a photograph from his graduation from flight school, young and proud in his new uniform. "He would be so incredibly proud of you," her mother said, her voice still thick with emotion. "You saved 198 lives today because he taught you how. His legacy isn't just the flights he flew or the passengers he transported safely for 20 years. It's you, Maya. It's what he gave you." It's the love he expressed through teaching that continued saving lives 4 years after he died. The passengers from Flight 2847 reached out over the following weeks. Some sent letters, handwritten notes of gratitude, attempts to express the inexpressible feeling of owing their life to a child they'd never met. Some requested to meet her, wanting to thank her in person, to see the face of the girl who had saved them. All of them wanted her to know that she had given them something precious, time with their families, the chance to see their children grow up, the opportunity to live their lives. Maya met some of them in carefully arranged meetings. A grandmother named Patricia who had been flying to see her first grandchild, now safely delivered and growing. A businessman named James who had closed the deal he was traveling for and had quit his high-stress job to spend more time with family. A young couple, Michael and Sarah, on their honeymoon, who showed her photos of the home they'd bought together. Each of them was alive because 4 years ago, a pilot had decided to teach his 7-year-old daughter emergency procedures in a home flight simulator. The psychological impact came slowly, building over weeks and months. Maya had nightmares where she couldn't reach the pedals, where the runway appeared too late, where the aircraft wouldn't stop rolling and plunged off the runway into darkness. She woke screaming some nights, her body convinced she was still in that cockpit bearing impossible responsibility. Other nights she dreamed of her father, standing behind her in the simulator, his hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and steady, "You can do this, Maya. Trust your training." Her mother enrolled her in counseling with a therapist who specialized in childhood trauma. Dr. Patricia Morrison had worked with child survivors of disasters, and she helped Maya understand that it was okay to have saved lives and still feel traumatized, that courage and fear weren't opposites but companions, that she'd carried an impossible burden and it was appropriate to feel the weight of it. "You did something extraordinary," Dr. Morrison told her during one of their sessions. "But you're still 11 years old. Your brain is still developing, and you experience stress that most adults never face. The nightmares, the anxiety, the way you sometimes freeze when you hear aircraft overhead, these are normal responses to abnormal circumstances." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd made a mistake," Maya admitted. "If I'd crashed the aircraft. All those people would have died because I wasn't good enough." "But you didn't make that mistake," Dr. Morrison said gently. "You did everything right. You trusted your training, you accepted help from the controllers, and you brought everyone safely home. The what-ifs will haunt you if you let them, but they're not real. What's real is that 198 people are alive because you had the knowledge and the courage to act." The aviation community struggled with how to categorize Maya's actions. The FAA ultimately classified her landing as an exceptional emergency response while carefully noting that it didn't establish any precedent for allowing untrained minors to pilot aircraft. Training protocols were reviewed at multiple airlines. Discussions began about child aviation education, about how to identify and nurture exceptional talent while protecting children from inappropriate risk and responsibility. Some aviation experts argued that Maya's father had been irresponsible, that teaching intensive emergency procedures to a 7-year-old had been inappropriate regardless of the outcome. Others countered that Captain Chen had simply passed on knowledge, that he couldn't have predicted this exact emergency, but that knowledge itself was never harmful. The debates continued in aviation journals, safety conferences, and online forums. But for Maya, the meaning of that day settled into something simpler and more profound over time. She had honored her father's memory by using what he'd taught her. She had proven that love expressed through teaching continues saving lives long after someone dies. She had demonstrated that children sometimes inherit not just their parents' physical features but their capabilities, their knowledge, their willingness to act when action seems impossible. She returned to school 3 months after the emergency, though her life would never be normal again. Her school arranged for security to manage the media attention. Teachers treated her differently, some with awe, others with discomfort at having a celebrity student. Classmates oscillated between wanting to be her friend because of her fame and resenting her for the attention she received. The social dynamics were complicated and exhausting. She did complete her book report on The Giver, writing about themes of inherited knowledge and individual responsibility that most 11-year-olds wouldn't comprehend but that she understood with painful clarity. Her teacher gave her an A+ and wrote in the comments, "Your personal insights into the weight of knowledge and responsibility are profound and clearly come from experience most people never face." She kept studying aviation, though with less obsession and more perspective. She understood now that her father's training had been both gift and burden. It had saved lives but had also placed enormous responsibility on a child's shoulders. She joined an online community of young aviation enthusiasts, finding comfort in discussing aircraft systems and procedures with other teenagers who shared her passion. Some of them knew who she was, others didn't. She appreciated both groups equally. On the first anniversary of Flight 2847, Maya visited her father's grave for the first time since his funeral. She'd avoided it before. The finality of the headstone, the reality of his permanent absence had been too overwhelming. But now she needed to tell him what had happened, needed to close the circle between his teaching and her survival. She knelt on the grass beside his grave, her hand resting on the cool marble of the headstone that read, "Captain David Chin, 1975 to 2021, beloved husband and father, his legacy soars." "I did it, Dad," she said softly, her voice catching. "I used everything you taught me. The emergency procedures, the system knowledge, the way you taught me to stay calm and trust my training. I saved 198 people. I saved them because of you." The wind moved through the cemetery trees, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant flowers. Above, an aircraft passed through the sky at altitude, its contrail white against the blue, carrying passengers who would never know the name of the pilot guiding them safely through the air. "I miss you every day," Maya continued, tears running freely now. "I miss our simulator sessions. I miss the way you'd explain everything so patiently. I miss how you believed I could understand things that most kids my age couldn't. And I understand now why you taught me all of it. Not because you thought I'd ever need to use it, but because knowledge is never wasted. Because capability matters. Because preparing someone to handle extraordinary circumstances is the greatest gift a teacher can give." She stood slowly, her hand trailing across the headstone one final time. "You're still here, Dad. You're in everything you taught me, every procedure I remember, every moment I choose to act instead of freezing. You saved those people. Through me. Your legacy isn't finished. It's going to continue in every choice I make, every time I help someone, every moment I use what you taught me to make the world a little bit better." The aircraft overhead had passed from sight, but Maya could still hear its distant engines, could imagine the pilots in their cockpit conducting their routine procedures, could feel the connection to her father through the shared language of aviation that he'd given her. She walked back to her mother's car, carrying the weight of her experience but no longer crushed by it. She was 12 years old now. She had saved 198 lives. She had honored her father's legacy. She had learned that sometimes extraordinary circumstances don't create heroes, they simply reveal the extraordinary capabilities that love and teaching have quietly built over time, preparing us for moments we never imagined we'd face. The sky continued its eternal dance above, aircraft crossing paths at perfect altitudes, controllers guiding them through invisible corridors, pilots executing the countless routine procedures that kept millions of people safe every day. And among them flew pilots who had heard the story of Flight 2847, who had thought more carefully about their own training, who had perhaps taught their own children about aviation not because they expected them to face emergency but because knowledge itself was valuable, because capability mattered, because love expressed through teaching created possibilities that extended far beyond what either teacher or student could predict. And somewhere in that endless sky, Maya liked to imagine, her father flew among them, not physically, but in the legacy he'd created, in the lives he'd saved through his daughter's courage, in the proof that a parent's love could transcend death itself and continue protecting people years after that parent was gone. The world continued turning. Aircraft continued flying. And in countless homes, parents continued teaching their children things that might someday matter, not because disaster was expected, but because preparation was love, and knowledge was the greatest inheritance one generation could give to the next.